The psychic structures are important because they're a good lead-in into the defense mechanism. So for you to understand defense mechanisms fully, you need to understand what the psychic structures are all about. And these, are, of course, are nothing more than Freudian psychology. So what we have is the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is the first one to occur. And the id is something that we're born with. The id is where we have certain drives, which of course are also called instincts. And because they're present at birth, you can imagine they're going to be very basic. And if you ever consider what the id drives are, there's nothing more than sexual drives and aggressive drives. And as the child is developing, these are the only two things that are going on: sexual urges and aggressive urges, of course, according to parts of Freudian psychology. But as you mature, as you get your ethics, your values from your parents, as you grow up and you learn the difference between right and wrong, then another set of psychic structures will develop, and that's where the superego comes in. The superego is basically what is your conscience, your sense of value, your sense of ethics, your sense of duty. So the id and the superego are in constant struggle, and the one that mediates between the id and the superego will be the ego. So the ego is the one that is responsible for defense mechanisms. And of course, the ego tends to be developed shortly after birth. Now, defense mechanisms, of course, are essential in understanding different disorders of psychiatry, different personality disorders as well. But before you know what the different defense mechanisms are, you need to understand what makes up defense mechanisms. And they're nothing more than the ways and means that the ego wards off anxiety. So these are things that the ego will do in order to not make us aware of what's happening in our lives. So when we get upset, when we get angry, when something happens to us, we of course are not aware of it because the ego has stepped in, has thrown out a defense mechanism, and the defense mechanism is taking over and helping us control our emotions. Therefore, defense mechanisms tend to be unconscious. The only conscious defense mechanism will be suppression. Defense mechanisms are dynamic, they tend to be irreversible, and they tend to be adaptive. So usually it's a good thing to have defense mechanisms. However, when defense mechanisms become maladaptive, that's when you as a physician has to step in and do something about it. So let's review the different defense mechanisms. The first one will be projection. And that is where you attribute your own wishes or feelings onto someone else. So whatever it is that you're thinking of, you're going to say someone is thinking about that. Whatever it is that you want to do, you're going to say someone else wants to do that. So if you don't like your neighbor, you're going to accuse your neighbor of not liking you. If you want to cheat on your partner, you're going to say your partner is the one that wants to cheat on you. And that's what projection is all about. This is the main defense mechanism that we see in patients who have the paranoid personality disorder. So their main defense will be projection. And why is that? Because people who have the paranoid personality are suspicious. They're mistrustful. They always question the loyalty of family. They always question the loyalty of friends. So that suspiciousness is their inner core. And that suspiciousness comes from them wanting to do things, wanting to talk about other people, wanting to lie to you, but yet they accuse you of doing those things to them. And that is what projection is all about. Denial, on the other hand, is things that we do in order to become unaware of painful aspect of reality. So denial is where the person has just been diagnosed with cancer, and what do they say? There's nothing wrong with me. Or the husband whose wife died, and he sets the table for two individuals. Those are all forms of denial. The classic setting for a denial question usually is in the hospital setting. So they'll usually give you a presentation where a patient has just been told that they have this horrible illness, and the patient yet doesn't believe it or doesn't do anything about it. Splitting is where external objects are divided into all good or all bad. This is the main defense mechanism used by the borderline personality disorder. Now, these are individuals where their world is not with shades of gray. They tend to view the world as either all black or all white. So in the borderline's mind, if you are good, you are what's called idealized. If you are bad, you are what's called devalued. So therefore, their world is also an idealization versus a devaluation. So the morning staff is better than the evening staff. Dr. A is a miracle worker, whereas Dr. B is totally incompetent. So you're always going to have the distinction where one thing is completely idealized, meaning it's all good, and another thing is completely devalued, meaning that it is all bad. And that's what you find in the borderlines. Blocking is a temporary block in thinking. So what tends to happen in blocking is that you have been told certain things and you just forget. For example, when you say, I can't remember his name, it's right on the tip of my tongue. So what's probably happening is that that information that you were about to recall might have some kind of emotional charge to it. So what the defense mechanism does is that it blocks it. So you don't remember it, you don't recall it, so therefore it's not painful to you. Regression has been called the most immature of all the defense mechanisms. The reason being that in regression we are going backwards. We're going from a stage where we, of course, were very mature and now we are regressing. And the classic example is the child that wets the bed. So now you have a child who's 7, who is perfectly toilet trained, but now has a baby brother, baby sister, or maybe his parents get a divorce. What that child can do is wet the bed and suck his thumb. Why? Because that child is going backwards to the stage where toilet training was not yet done. So the fact that you go backwards is called a regression. When adults regress, then what we tend to do is not, of course, wet the bed, but is that we become childlike. We might have a temper tantrum. I might stomp my feet and walk out of this room right now. That is a form of regression. So whenever you see a question where someone does not act their right age and they're going backwards, then of course regression is the classic answer. Somatization is where psychic derivatives are converted into bodily symptoms. This is the main defense mechanism of the somatoform disorders. These were the disorders where these individuals believed that there was something physically wrong with them when actually there's nothing wrong. These are the individuals that believe that they had either blindness or paralysis or that they had heart disease when actually nothing is wrong. So the key to somatization is that the person is convinced that there's something physically wrong with them. Introjection is when features of the external world are taken and made part of the self. This in turn is similar to a projection, but it's in the opposite direction. In projection, whatever it is that I think, I'm going to say you're thinking that. And in introjection, it's going to be the exact opposite. So whatever it is that you think, I think. Whatever you do, I do. Whatever you believe, then of course I'm going to believe it. So when you see an example where the resident acts and dresses like the attending physician, that is a classic introjection. It's not imitation, because imitation is conscious. So if you want to think about it, introjection is nothing more than an unconscious form of imitation. Displacement is when an emotion or drive is shifted to another that resembles the original in some aspect or quality. This is nothing more than the classic scapegoat. I'm angry at someone and I yell at someone else. Why? Because it's easier to yell at someone else. I want to do something, you tell me no, I slam the door. So I'm taking out my anger on something else, on someone else, and that's what displacement tends to be. Repression is when an idea or feeling is withheld from consciousness, and it has to do with memory. For example, in repression, there are certain things that happen to us when we're young, and I'm sure things have happened to all of us when we've been younger. The fact that we do not remember all of our memories is what repression deals with. So there are certain painful memories, which are usually repressed memories, which we'd rather not think about, we'd rather not remember. So the fact that we do not know that we had them will make them a repression. If later on we understand that we have them, but we'd rather forget them, that will be suppression, but we're going to go over suppression later on. Intellectualization is the excessive use of intellectual processes to avoid effective expression or experience. So what we're doing in intellectualization is trying to understand what is wrong. By understanding it, what happens to the fear, what happens to the anxiety? They go away. So when the fear and the anxiety go away, then of course we are able to deal with whatever it is. So if you've just been told you have cancer, what do? You go to the bookstore and you read books on cancer. You go to the medical bookstore and you get textbooks on cancer. You go to the cancer centers and you go to seminars. You read journals on cancer. And when you talk about your cancer, you talk about it in a very intellectual and unemotional way. And that's what intellectualization is all about. If you look at the example here, it is interesting to note the specific skin lesions which seem to arise as a consequence of my end-stage disease. So if you have HIV and now you have Kaposi's, how many of you would find it interesting that you have these skin lesions? Most of us would not. But yet this individual does, because they're using a defense mechanism to deal with their emotions. And remember, all of this is happening in an unconscious state. Isolation is separation of an idea from the affect that accompanies it. So what's happening in isolation is that we are separating how we feel with how we express our emotions. So the classic examples in isolation will be someone who has experienced something horrible. But yet, how do they respond? They show no emotion. As she arrived at the station to identify the body, she appeared to show no emotion. That is what isolation is all about. The fact that you say things very matter-of-factly, when in reality you should have some emotion on your face, that is what isolation would be. Rationalization is when you are going to use rational explanations to justify your own attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. And this is nothing more than an excuse. For example, substance abusers. When they drink, they make up excuses. Why do you drink? I drink because I've got stress at work. I drink because my friends drink and I don't want them to think I'm some kind of wuss. That is an excuse. So when you make an excuse for your behavior, that's what rationalization is all about. Reaction formation is when an unacceptable impulse is transformed into its opposite, and it results in the formation of a character trait. This, of course, is seen in obsessive-compulsive disorder. So in obsessive-compulsive disorders, you have thoughts. Now, these thoughts, we find them unacceptable. So what our brain does is that it makes us do the opposite in order to handle our thoughts. So what the reaction formation does is that it stops us from acting out on these thoughts. It stops us from engaging in the thoughts that we want to do. A classic example is if you want to start fires, that is unacceptable. So what could you become in order to not start these fires? You become a firefighter, and that is the reaction formation. You are doing the exact opposite. Instead of starting it, you're actually putting it out. An undoing is nothing more than the acting out the reverse of an unacceptable behavior. This is also seen in obsessive-compulsive disorder, except this is the compulsion, whereas the reaction formation is the obsession. So the undoing is the act itself. So when the fireman is putting out the fire, that is the undoing, because that is the act. If any of you are superstitious and you spill salt on the table, what will happen to you? Probably bad luck. How do you undo the bad luck? You throw it over your shoulder. If you have OCD and you believe that everything is contaminated and you feel you've gotten dirty, that is unacceptable to you. So how do you undo the getting dirty? Very simply, you wash your hands. And the washing of the hands is, of course, the undoing. Whereas the thinking of the dirt, thinking that you've gotten contaminated, would be the reaction formation, because that is the obsession. Acting out is nothing more than an outburst. It tends to be a behavioral outburst or an emotional outburst. And these are things that we do because we cannot handle what's about to happen, what we're going to talk about, the situation that we're in. Let's say that you were abused sexually as a child by your parents. So now you are in a group with incest survivors, and everyone is talking about their experiences. Yet when it's your turn to talk, what do? Instead of talking, you get up, you scream, you throw something, and you run out of the room. That is an acting out. So it's an outburst that helps you deal with the situation at hand. Humor permits the expressions and feelings and thoughts without personal discomfort. So these are jokes, these are things that we do in order to make light of situations, but what they do is that they help us cope. If you ever see stand-up comics, what is it that they always talk about? Their horrible lives, their terrible experiences, and they make a joke about it. The fact that you joke about it is humor, and that's a defense mechanism. And humor, of course, is one of the mature defense mechanisms to have. Sublimation is where impulse gratification has been achieved, but the aim or object has been changed from an unacceptable one to an acceptable one. A lot of people get confused between reaction formation and sublimation. They can be similar to a point. However, in reaction formation, what you find unacceptable, you find a way to stop it. So you do the exact opposite. In sublimation, what you find unacceptable, you actually find a way to do it. But you do it in a way that is acceptable. So let's use the example of starting the fire. If you want to go around starting fires, you find it unacceptable. If you use reaction formation, you become a firefighter and put them out. So you don't start fires. If you use sublimation, then you go work in Hollywood. You work in special effects department, and what do? You start building fires. You blow things up. Why? Because that allows you to do it. Working in the special effects department gives you the venue to start as many fires as you want, yet you're not going to go to prison. So you found a way to channel that instinct, that urge, into something that is totally acceptable. And because you found a way to channel these urges or instincts of yours, that is why sublimation has been considered the most mature of all the defense mechanisms. It's really the healthiest one to have. Suppression is nothing more than conscious forgetting. So if you've been sexually abused as a child, but you do not remember, that memory is called a repression. If you were to go into therapy and you start to remember your past abuse, but given that it's painful, you'd rather forget it, but you know that you were abused, that becomes a suppression. So the main difference between a repression and a suppression is whether or not you're aware of the memory. That's why repressions are called unconscious forgetting and suppressions are called conscious forgetting. So when you say, yes, I know I was abused, but you know what? I don't want to talk about it because it was very painful. That is what suppression is all about. Let's look at some questions. Number 1, a nurse working in a hospice has been ignoring an elderly female patient who has terminal cancer. When asked why she has been ignoring the patient, the nurse replied, she wants to be left alone. Which of the following defense mechanism best explains her response? A, rationalization, where you make an excuse. B, isolation of affect, where you would of course show no emotion. C, intellectualization, where you use intellectual processes to avoid expression. D, projection, where you transfer your thoughts, feelings, and wishes onto someone else. Or E, denial, where you basically say it doesn't happen. So here she's making an excuse. So many of you would choose A as the correct answer. But in reality, the correct answer is D, projection. She's not excusing herself. She's not saying to you, I have to go to a meeting, I had to take care of another patient. What she's actually saying is she, the other patient, wants to be left alone. And that's a classic projection. So in reality, who is it that wants to be left alone? It's her. But she's using the other patient as the projection. So question 1, the answer is D, projection. Let's review some tests which do get asked on your exam, but this of course is a very short and concise form of reviewing this material. So I'm going to go over intelligence testing, I'm going to go over personality testing, etc. So let's start off with intelligence quotient, or IQ. What IQ does is that it measures academic performance. IQ will not tell you how much money you're going to make. IQ is not going to tell you what kind of career you're going to have. All that IQ tells you is what is your potential, what is expected of you. If you have a very high IQ, but you've got terrible grades, that just means you're a really, really bad slacker. It has nothing to do with whether or not you could do it. Basically, you have the potential, yet you're choosing not to do it. So IQ is measured in two ways. You either have the mental age method, which is a formula. So you have IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age times 100. Mental age, of course, is how you perform on the test, whereas chronological age is your age in years. So if you are 10 years old, that is your chronological age. But if you score like a 12-year-old, then what would your IQ be? It would be 12 divided by 10 times 100. So your IQ would be 120. And that's one method of determining the IQ. The other method of determining the IQ would be the deviation from the norm's standard. That, of course, will use standard deviation, and you need to understand what the mean and the standard deviation for IQ will be. So the mean IQ is 100, and the standard deviation will be 15. So a common question would be, what is the IQ of 68% of the class? And because we're looking at 68%, we know we're looking at +1 and -1 standard deviation, so the IQ range would be 85 to 115, and that's what you would put down as the answer. When we assess IQ, we do IQ tests for adults and we do IQ tests for children. For adults, we have, of course, the WAIS-R, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale Revised, and it's for everybody over the age of 17. When they are under the age of 17, then we will use the WISC-R, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children Revised. So we're looking at children greater than 6 up to 17, and we will determine what their IQ will be. When we assess personality tests, then what we're going to look at is it objective or is it projective? Now, the classic objective test is a test that does not use any ambiguous stimuli. So it's a test that uses simple stimuli. For example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. That is a test that will give you questions. That's the simple stimuli. Because the stimuli is simple, it's going to give you limited answers. It's going to give you simple answers like true and false. So if the stimuli is simple, the answers are limited. What's important about these objective tests is that you really do not need a lot of clinical experience or training like you would with the other projective tests. So the MMPI is your classic objective tests. The projective tests are different in that they're going to give you ambiguous stimuli. There is basically no right-wrong answer to these tests. Because the stimuli is very ambiguous, you're going to have a lot of answers that are possible. Because of the broad range of answers, you need a lot of clinical training to administer these tests. And the most common of the projective tests would be the Rorschach, which is the ink blot, the thematic apperception test, or the TAT, where they give you a picture and you have to tell a story. You also have the sentence completion, where they give you part of a sentence and you have to finish it. And of course, you have the drawings. So you would basically have to draw a person, a house, a tree, a family, etc. As you can imagine, if you're dealing with a child, what would be easier for that child as far as testing would be? Do you want to give them a test like the objective test, or do you want to give them the projective test? And for children, because they really don't understand things in great detail, projective tests are much easier, such as the drawings, such as a sentence completion, or actually telling a story from a picture.